So, Jesse, staying in California for our next case, but we're moving over now to a neighborhood called Palmdale. This has become a national story. It is, of course, a national issue. And there's even a Netflix documentary about this case. We cover a lot of cases about children who die at the hands of their abusive parents. And then, naturally, we always ask, almost all of the time, these families and these children are either under investigation, either under the supervision of Child Protective Services, or the children have been taken away and brought back, right? So we see this theme all of the time in crimes against children. And what is so unique about this case is that authorities decided to go ahead and charge the social workers with a form of child abuse because of their inactions may have led to the death of this child. And that's what I find interesting here.
Yeah, I understand. First, let me just say, I've covered a ton of child abuse cases, trials regarding it, horrific things. This is the worst case of child abuse that I personally have ever heard, ever. And I hate talking about it. I mean, it's important to talk about it. It's such a pivotal case. But it's the most disturbing thing I've ever heard. And I think the problem is, and one of the reasons that people love true crime, people want a sense of understanding why. Why do these crimes happen? Why would somebody do this? And the problem that I keep coming back to with this case is I don't understand why. I really don't understand. I don't understand why this child died, and I don't understand how this case slipped through the cracks. And as much as I look into it, as much as I've read the law on it, I still am left with that. And that's what I'm actually so disturbed by, that I wish I had a better answer for it. But it is just absolutely chilling to think that this still happens and that this could happen. And to think about the young boy here, what he went through, if everybody just takes a step back and think about that, that's something I just can't process.
I can't process it, but over and over, it is the same story. Abusive parents kill their children. Children cry out for help. And in this case, this little 8-year-old, according to court records, wrote a suicide note. So there are almost always cries for help. People see things, people hear things, and yet these children still die at the hands of their parents and in the most heinous ways that anyone can imagine. It is disgusting. It is disturbing. And I don't know, can the law ever truly protect a child from a demented parent that has no moral compass and has no problem torturing a child and then killing him or her?
Especially when you have people who work for the Department of Child and Family Services that take the word of the parent over the child. Or you have a situation where you don't assess, well, maybe the child is not really telling the truth about what's going on because they're afraid of the parent or the caregiver. That's what happened here. That's what happened here. So many instances where this could have been averted if you just would have listened, but you didn't. And I know we're going to go through the facts of this case, but the teacher in this case was the only one who was listening and tried to do as much as she could to save this child. But at the end of the day, there was nothing more to do.
No. So what this case is, what the latest in this long case is that this has been an attempt to hold the social workers responsible for the death of this 8-year-old. So these charges were brought against 4 Los Angeles County social workers, 2 social workers and the 2 supervisors. The boy had been beaten and tortured by his mother and by her boyfriend. The boy, Gabriel Fernandez, died in May of 2013, and we're still discussing this 7 years later. So a few weeks ago, the judge hearing the case against the social workers dropped the charges against them. Now, the 4 had visited the child, and this is what's so interesting. You know, they were involved with 2 had visited, and then the supervisors, yet with all this crap going on, nobody found that there was reason enough to remove the child. And this case, living here in Los Angeles, I can tell you that this is the kind of case that we all have talked about and heard and seen the progression. And it was years after even the mother and the boyfriend were convicted of murdering the child that the charges were brought against the social workers. It was a way for the authorities here in Los Angeles County to try to hold someone accountable, that it wasn't enough to say the kid slipped through the cracks, right? And that's what this case was about, this most recent legal case. So Gabriel's mother, Pearl Fernandez, was sentenced to life in prison without parole for the murder of her son, and her boyfriend, Isaro Aguirre, was sentenced to death with special circumstances because he's the one who apparently physically tortured the boy in this instance. The question was, and it is still now, were these social workers incompetent? Did the system work against the child and maybe the social workers to make it possible for them to make a difference? Or were these social workers actually child abusers because of the end results? And that's what this case was trying to resolve, but the judges dropped the charges and said, no, we cannot charge you with child abuse.
Well, there's a couple of things there. So one, they were charged with child abuse and also falsifying records.
Yes, we're going to get to that too.
And the thing with that is, so when I was in law school, one of the things that we always learned was a judge, a court, they always think about a slippery slope. Well, if we hold this person accountable, what happens here? And I think a big concern was if we hold social workers accountable, if we hold them criminally liable for the actions of the caregiver, the actions of a parent, we're going to have a situation where social workers are going to be more concerned about their careers than the safety of the children. Because if you flip it around and you say, well, I'm going to take this child away, even if I hear that the parent slapped the child once, I'm going to take the child out there because I'm afraid that I'm going to be convicted and I'm going to be sentenced to convicted of child abuse and sentenced. When in reality, it might be beneficial to keep the child in that home and do a situation of counseling or things like that. Here, the problem was, and the court said that we can get into the law of it about how they ultimately decided that these social workers shouldn't be held accountable, but it was a situation where they didn't want to have a slippery slope, that we can't hold social workers to this level of degree. They could be fired. You could say that they were really bad at their jobs. That's one thing, but to hold them criminally liable here is a different story. I have my own opinion about that because I think that we can't just paint a brush and say that social workers are not always responsible, because there's a situation here, and the court said the same thing, like it's a police officer, right? So if a police officer ultimately shoots someone, you can ultimately charge the officer with murder. But if an officer chooses not to arrest somebody, you're not going to prosecute the officer for doing that. You can fire the officer, and that's how they made that comparison. I think if you are in the position of your whole responsibility as a social worker is to protect the child, and there's ample evidence the child dies from that, and you allegedly falsified reports, you are entering into a different threshold. So you could say, yeah, the court said, oh, they weren't really officers under the statute, or they didn't have legal control over the child in the same way that a caregiver has, or they didn't have legal control over the parents, so they're not responsible. Yeah, I get it. I'm a lawyer. I can read through the text myself. I still think that there was an element here that was missing, and I think there was a tragedy here with what happened.
And the 4 social workers were immediately put on whatever desk duty is for a social worker. I'm really not sure. Then they were ultimately fired, and then these charges were brought against them. So there were actions that were taken without question. And I do believe in my heart that no one wants to see a child tortured and no one wants to see a child die. But at the end of the day, if you are tasked with trying to protect a child and you are either the allegations about the falsifying of the records included things like records that were incomplete, notes that didn't have the details that reflected what should have been in an interview, not fully interviewing the child or saying that you did interview the child and you didn't. Failure to see that the child's physical condition was clearly deteriorating and not noting that in the notes. Those are some of the examples.
Well, just to add to that, they also said in the reports that the mother, Pearl, and the young boy, Gabriel, they both had the capacity to go through counseling and that Pearl had a support system. What? If you read through the facts of that, how on earth do you think that that's the case? So that's where it kind of became that clearly they were lying about what it was. I mean, do you really have that bad a judgment, or did you falsify the report?
What's also interesting is that, and this happens a lot. Police, the sheriff's department, because sheriffs patrol in that area, were called to the house numerous times. I believe there was something like 9 sheriff's deputies who had responded to the house over the years. And, that's always an indication that there's trouble. And one of the points here is, okay, so they would have either knocked on the door, entered the house, and they themselves did not think that the situation for which they were called ever warranted removing the child, arresting the parents, or doing something, correct? So it's not just the social workers here.
Right. Well, there's a problem. And the problem is that whenever there was a visit to the home, Gabriel, who would originally tell his teacher that he was being abused, she saw the bruises, he would change his story when there was a visit and say, oh, it was an accident. I was just joking. The other kids who were in the house would say, we've never saw anything. I believe Pearl and her boyfriend took drug tests. They came back negative. So it looked like a situation. And by the way, Pearl said that her son, Gabriel, was making all this up or embellishing because he really wanted to live with the grandparents. He has social issues. He's aggressive. So the fact that they flipped the narrative, I understand there was confusion here. And I get that. But also, as I said at the beginning, you have to read through the lines. You have to read through the lines. Is it not possible that Gabriel was scared, that the kids were scared, that the mother and the boyfriend were saying whatever they needed to say in order to get out of it? I mean, yeah, hindsight's 20/20, but
aren't you worried? As I was reviewing the facts last night for this, I started thinking about, because of the pandemic and because of the limited services and the reduced face-to-face contact or visits, I know that domestic violence has increased, but what about the kids who are being abused? Like, if we thought that the system was imperfect and still is it not far worse now when these kids are even more vulnerable?
And that's an amazing question, because you have to think about what is the process that goes into these visits now. Are you doing it over Zoom when you could hide a lot of what's going on? Do you make a visit when everybody who makes a visit to another person's home wearing a mask, all you want to do is run out of there as quickly as possible? And this is not like a domestic violence situation where you can have a spouse call up and say they're in trouble. You have young children who have no way to ask for help. I think you've really hit it on the head. So this pandemic is creating a worse situation in a lot of ways, including that.
So let's go into the facts of what happened with Gabriel a little bit more. When paramedics found him, now remember, he's 8 years old. He was naked. He wasn't breathing. He was severely beaten. His skull was crushed in. He had 3 broken ribs, and he had been shot with a BB gun, and the pellets of the BB gun were lodged in his lung and in his groin. Okay.
And burns.
So in 2016, so that would have been 3 years after Gabriel's death, that is when the 2 social workers and their supervisors were finally charged with the 1 count of felony child abuse, 1 count of falsifying the records. And the prosecutors kept saying over and over again, they missed warning signs. And I know we just talked about that, but there's a theme here, right? So when they looked at the records, because there was a grand jury, and fortunately, as a result of the grand jury, that's the other thing that's not happening now, Jesse. Grand juries are not being convened. They can't because of the social distancing issue.
Right. So
that's when they found a lot more information. And, one of the biggest problems that I find with getting justice for children of child abuse, especially when the system is involved, is that both the Department of Family Services, their attorneys, all claim that all of this information is privileged, confidential, and can never be released. And that is why the public and reporters, it's something I have fought against here in LA County for a long time, advocating for more transparency because of cases like this. And I have to tell you, we've barely made a dent. Made a dent.
It's a sensitive, because you're dealing with sensitive subject matter. There's one thing, you're dealing with children. And I get that argument. But I think this is the kind of situation where you need even more transparency. And look, the sad fact of the matter is, when you have a case like Gabriel Fernandez that makes it to the headlines, there has to be change. There has to be. Because unfortunately, while we see this more and more, people are realizing that it shouldn't be happening. And there needs to be a change in the system.
So as part of the further investigation into what happened to Gabriel and the grand jury hearings, and finally some of this stuff was made public, we found out that Gabriel's older siblings testified that Gabriel had been forced to eat cat feces, and if he vomited, he was forced to eat his vomit. He slept locked in a cabinet with a sock in his mouth to keep him from screaming. So that's the life that he lived. And it may not be criminal what happened to the others who were responsible for Gabriel's life and safety, but it's morally a crime. It is morally a crime what has happened to this child.
And I think that they realize that. So even though they don't have criminal liability, they have all expressed regret and they all understand that this is a nightmare. They all wish they could have done something different. You know, I remember hearing that one of the supervisors said that 200 cases he was overlooking, but this is the one that's going to haunt him for the rest of his life, and rightfully so. So this is a situation where, you know, if you have a textbook example of what we should have done more, this is that example. This is the one that you need to say, we need to change the way that we're doing this because it didn't work. That's the end of the problem. At the end of the day, nobody cares how you build a watch. They just want it to work. At the end of the day, we want children to be safe. We want the social workers to do their job and do everything that they can. So when the fact of the matter is the teacher, Gabriel's teacher, seemed to be doing more because every time he came in with a bruise or any time she suspected something, she did her duty and immediately contacted the social workers. There were times towards the end of this, and again, when the social workers were told these different stories that Gabriel's really fine and all this, when they stopped returning her calls. So the teacher, I really believe, was the hero of this entire saga and tried to do as much as she could. But there's only so much a teacher can do. They're supposed to report it, but they're not supposed to go in the home and take the child away.
Yeah. I'm just going to leave you with a final note from the judge about this case, about whether those social workers and their supervisors can be held accountable in cases like this. And this is what the higher court ruled. Although there may be consequences to social workers who fail to fulfill their duties, the consequences do not include criminal liability for child abuse. But as I said, morally, yes, absolutely.